Naomi Bennett's hands shook as she held the small rubber object under the bathroom light. It was covered in blood and infection, and she could barely believe what she'd just done. Behind her, 7-year-old Cameron Winters touched his ears with trembling fingers, his mouth open in shock. Then he whispered something that made Naomi's heart stop. I hear you." His voice was rough, uncertain, like someone learning to speak for the first time, because that's exactly what was happening. "I hear the water running," Cameron said, louder now, tears streaming down his face. I hear everything." Naomi dropped to her knees, sobbing, as Cameron ran to the window and pressed his hands against the glass. For the first time in his 7 years of life, he could hear birds singing, wind in the trees. The world that had been completely silent was suddenly, impossibly, full of sound. But in exactly 3 hours, Cameron's father would come home. And Naomi would have to explain what she'd just done. Something that could either save Cameron's life or send her to prison. Can you imagine that moment, knowing you did something that could change a child's life forever, but also knowing it might destroy your own? But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began. 6 weeks earlier, Naomi Bennett stood outside the biggest house she'd ever seen. The Winters mansion looked like something from a movie. White columns, perfectly trimmed gardens, a fountain in the driveway that probably cost more than her entire apartment building. Naomi clutched her bag tightly, trying not to feel intimidated. She needed this job. After losing her last 3 housekeeping positions because clients found her too involved with their families, she was running out of options. The job posting had been specific. Housekeeper needed for household with special needs child. Experience with disabilities preferred. Must be patient, observant, and comfortable with non-traditional communication. Naomi had read that line 5 times before applying, because 18 years ago she'd lost her younger brother Jeremiah to complications from untreated ear infections. Jeremiah had been deaf, and their family had been too poor to afford the specialists, the devices, the treatments that might have saved him. Before Jeremiah died at 14, he'd made Naomi promise, "If you ever meet another deaf kid, you help them. You don't let them be alone like I was." Wait, I need to tell you something crucial about Naomi's brother, because it explains everything she did next. Jeremiah didn't die from being deaf. He died because doctors didn't take his ear infection seriously. They said it was just inflammation, and sent him home without proper treatment. By the time anyone realized how bad it was, the infection had spread. Naomi had carried that guilt for 18 years. The guilt of not pushing harder, not demanding better care, not fighting for her little brother when he needed her most. Marcus Winters opened the door himself, which surprised Naomi. Billionaires usually had assistants for that. He was tall, in his late 30s, with the kind of exhaustion in his eyes that money couldn't hide. "Ms. Bennett, come in. I'll be honest with you. You're the 7th interview this month. Most people don't last a week once they realize what working here actually means." Naomi followed him through rooms that could have been in a museum. Everything was expensive, clean, perfect, and completely, eerily silent. "My son Cameron is 7 years old," Marcus said, his voice tight. "He was born profoundly deaf. We've spent $8 million over the past 7 years on specialists, surgeries, devices, treatments. Everything failed. The world's top audiologists all say the same thing. Permanent bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. No cure, no surgical option, nothing." Marcus stopped at a closed door. "Cameron communicates through sign language. He's brilliant, but he's also withdrawn. Angry sometimes. The previous housekeepers couldn't handle his tantrums, his isolation. They said working here felt like living in a tomb." Little did Naomi know, what was waiting behind that door would break her heart, and eventually lead her to do something that would change everything. Marcus opened the door to reveal the most heartbreaking room Naomi had ever seen. It was filled with expensive toys, all untouched. Educational equipment, all unused. And in the corner, sitting by a window, was a small boy with dark hair, staring out at a world he couldn't hear. Cameron didn't turn when they entered. He was completely absorbed in watching birds outside, birds whose songs he'd never heard, trees moving in wind he couldn't experience, a world happening in silence. "Cameron," Marcus signed, walking over and touching his son's shoulder. Cameron flinched, then turned slowly. His eyes were guarded, defensive, like someone expecting to be disappointed again. "This is Ms. Bennett," Marcus signed. "She's going to be helping around the house." Cameron looked at Naomi for exactly 2 seconds, then turned back to the window. Dismissed, uninterested, alone. Marcus sighed. That's actually better than usual. Last week he threw a toy at the new housekeeper within 5 minutes. Naomi watched Cameron, and something in her chest ached. He looked exactly like Jeremiah used to look, isolated, resigned to being different, expecting nothing from the world around him. Have you ever met someone and just known, somehow, that you were meant to help them? That's what Naomi felt in that moment. In exactly 4 weeks, Naomi would discover something that 7 years of specialists had missed. But first, she had to earn Cameron's trust. Naomi's approach was different from everyone else who'd worked in the mansion. She didn't try to force Cameron to engage, didn't treat him like a project that needed fixing, didn't act like his deafness was a tragedy that defined him. On her first day, she simply cleaned his room while he sat by the window. She organized his toys, changed his sheets, and left a small photo album on his bed before leaving. The next day, Cameron was holding the photo album, looking at pictures of Naomi's brother, Jeremiah. Photos of a boy who looked happy despite being deaf. Photos of someone who understood. Cameron looked up at Naomi and signed something she hadn't expected. "Your brother?" Naomi nodded, then signed back. "His name was Jeremiah. He was deaf too. He died when I was your age. He would have liked you." Something shifted in Cameron's eyes. For the first time, he looked at Naomi like she was a real person, not just another adult who pitied him. Over the next week, Cameron started following Naomi around the house. Not interacting much, just present. Watching her work. Slowly, cautiously, trusting her. Naomi taught him small things. Not therapy, not educational goals. Just life. How to fold laundry, how to water plants, how to make cookies, feeling the mixer vibrate instead of hearing it. And Cameron smiled, actually smiled, something Marcus said he hadn't seen in months. Actually, let me pause here because this is important. Naomi wasn't trying to fix Cameron, she was trying to see him. And sometimes, being seen is more healing than any treatment. 3 weeks into the job, everything changed. A massive storm hit during the night. Thunder so loud it shook the mansion, lightning that lit up the sky. And Cameron, who couldn't hear the storm, suddenly woke up screaming. Naomi ran to his room and found him curled up on the floor, holding his right ear, tears streaming down his face. He was in obvious pain but couldn't explain what hurt because he was too young to have the vocabulary and sign language. Marcus rushed in, panicked. "What's wrong? What happened?" "His ear," Naomi signed quickly. "He's holding his right ear. He's in pain." Marcus looked confused. "That doesn't make sense. Cameron's deaf. Ear pain wouldn't—" "Mr. Winters, deaf people can still get ear infections. They can still feel pain. Something is wrong." Marcus immediately called the on-call pediatrician, who prescribed antibiotics over the phone without even examining Cameron. "Probably just a routine ear infection, common in kids. The antibiotics should clear it up in a few days." But Naomi had a sick feeling in her stomach, because she'd seen this before, with Jeremiah. Doctors dismissing ear pain as routine when it was actually something much worse. What Naomi discovered the next morning would make her question everything she'd been told about Cameron's deafness. The antibiotics did nothing. Cameron's pain got worse, and Naomi noticed something that made her blood run cold. Cameron's pillowcase had discharge on it, not drool like the previous housekeepers had assumed. Discharge from his ear. Naomi had seen this with Jeremiah. The discharge that came right before the infection got serious. The warning sign that everyone had ignored until it was too late. "Mr. Winters," Naomi said carefully that afternoon, "I think someone needs to actually look inside Cameron's ear, with proper equipment, not just prescribe antibiotics over the phone." Marcus barely looked up from his laptop. "Naomi, Cameron has been examined by the world's top audiologists. They would have found any physical issues. With respect, sir, when was the last time someone did a simple visual examination of his ear canal? Not an expensive hearing test, just looking inside his ear with a light?" Marcus frowned. "That would have been part of his initial evaluations when he was a baby. Why?" "Because I think there might be something in his ear, something blocking it. I saw something dark when he was in pain last night, but I couldn't get a good look." "That's impossible," Marcus said firmly. "If there was a blockage, the specialist would have found it years ago. Please, Naomi, I appreciate your concern, but leave the medical decisions to professionals." Wait, because here's what Naomi was thinking in that moment. She was thinking about Jeremiah, about how professionals had missed his infection until it killed him, about how sometimes the people with the most degrees are the ones who look the least carefully. That night, Naomi made a decision that terrified her. She was going to look in Cameron's ear herself. Really look, with the medical flashlight she'd bought at the pharmacy that afternoon. If she was wrong, Marcus would fire her for overstepping. If she was right, well, she didn't know what would happen if she was right. Cameron was sitting in his room, trying not to cry from the pain. When Naomi entered, he looked at her with desperate, trusting eyes. "Cameron," Naomi signed carefully, "your ear hurts, right?" He nodded, touching his right ear gently. "I want to look inside and see if I can help. It might be a little uncomfortable, but I promise I'll be gentle. Do you trust me?" Cameron stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and sat still. Naomi's hands shook as she turned on the flashlight and gently angled Cameron's head to see into his ear canal. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just a normal ear canal. But then, deep inside, barely visible, her breath caught. There was something there. Something dark and solid. Something that absolutely should not be inside a child's ear. What would you do in that situation? Risk everything to help a child, or play it safe and hope someone else notices? In exactly 48 hours, Naomi would make the choice that would either save Cameron's life or end her own freedom. But first, she had to decide if she was brave enough to challenge an entire system. Naomi tried one more time to convince Marcus. She showed him the discharge, explained Cameron's worsening pain, begged him to take Cameron to a doctor who would actually examine his ear. "Mr. Winters, please. I've seen this before. My brother Jeremiah, he had ear infections that everyone dismissed. By the time someone took it seriously, it was too late. Cameron's symptoms are exactly the same. Please, just have someone look." Marcus's face softened slightly. "Naomi, I know you care about Cameron, and I'm sorry about your brother. But Cameron's deafness isn't from an infection. It's genetic, permanent. 7 years of specialists have confirmed this. You need to accept that some things can't be fixed." "I'm not trying to fix him," Naomi said, her voice breaking. "I'm trying to help him because he's in pain. Whether he's deaf or not, he deserves to not suffer." Marcus looked torn. "I have a business trip tomorrow. I'll be gone for 3 days. I'll schedule an appointment with Cameron's audiologist for when I get back. But Naomi, you need to stop playing doctor. That's not your role here." After Marcus left the room, Naomi stood alone in the hallway, shaking with frustration and fear. Cameron's pain was getting worse. The discharge was increasing, and she had a terrible feeling that whatever was in his ear was causing serious damage that might be permanent if she waited 3 more days. What Naomi did next would either make her a hero or put her in handcuffs, and she had less than 12 hours to decide. That night, Naomi couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Jeremiah, about his last days when the infection had gotten so bad he could barely function, about the promise she'd made him. She pulled out the medical guides she'd been reading all week, articles about foreign objects in ear canals, videos about safe removal techniques, warnings about the dangers of attempting it without proper training. Everything she read said the same thing. Don't do it yourself. See a professional. One wrong move could cause permanent damage. But Naomi also read about what happens when foreign objects stay lodged in ears for too long. Infection, permanent hearing damage, in severe cases, brain damage or death. At 2 a.m., Naomi made her choice. She walked to Cameron's room and gently woke him up. "Cameron," she signed in the dim light, "I think I know why your ear hurts. There's something stuck inside, something that shouldn't be there. I want to try to help you, but I need you to be very, very brave and very, very still. Can you do that for me?" Cameron, exhausted from pain and trusting Naomi more than anyone else in his isolated life, nodded. "If your dad finds out I did this, he might be very angry with me," Naomi signed honestly. "I might lose my job. I might get in big trouble. But I can't watch you suffer when I think I can help, okay?" Cameron signed back something that made Naomi's eyes fill with tears. "You're like Jeremiah. You care." Actually, let me tell you what Naomi was risking. Not just her job. If she damaged Cameron's ear, she could be charged with assault, practicing medicine without a license, child endangerment. She could go to prison. But sometimes, love means risking everything. Naomi had prepared everything in Cameron's bathroom like a makeshift medical clinic. Clean towels, sterilized tweezers, a medical-grade flashlight, warm water for irrigation. Everything she'd learned from helping at her community health clinic years ago. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Okay, Cameron," she signed. "This might hurt a little. If it's too much, you tell me, and I stop immediately. Promise?" Cameron nodded, his small face serious and trusting. Naomi positioned the flashlight and looked deep into Cameron's ear canal. There it was, clearer now than before. A small rubber object, maybe part of a medical device, lodged deep inside and surrounded by infected tissue. Using warm water irrigation first, Naomi gently loosened the debris around the object. Cameron winced, but stayed perfectly still, just like he'd promised. Then, with tweezers sterilized and hands as steady as she could make them, Naomi began the careful, terrifying process of removing the foreign object. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Sweat ran down Naomi's back. One wrong move could puncture Cameron's eardrum, could cause permanent damage worse than deafness. 20 minutes, 30 minutes. The object was moving, slowly, incrementally, coming free from where it had been lodged for who knew how long. 45 minutes after she started, the object came free. A small piece of rubber tubing covered in dried blood and infected tissue, sitting in Naomi's palm like evidence of a crime. Naomi started crying with relief. She'd done it. She'd actually done it without causing damage. Cameron was okay. His ear was bleeding slightly, but Cameron's eyes went wide. His hands flew to his ears. His mouth opened in shock, and then he whispered, in a voice rough from never being used, "I hear something." Before we continue, if this story is gripping you, if you're feeling the same emotions Naomi felt in that impossible moment, do me a favor, hit that like button. Not because I need it, but because it tells YouTube to share this story with other people who need to hear it. People who've ever felt powerless to help someone they care about. People who've ever had to choose between following rules and following their heart. And drop a comment telling me, would you have done what Naomi did? Would you risk everything to help a child in pain? I read every single comment, and I want to know what you're thinking right now. Subscribe if you haven't already, because you're not going to want to miss what happens next. "I hear something," Cameron whispered again, louder this time, his voice cracking with emotion. "Naomi, I hear you. I hear your voice." Naomi was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She pulled Cameron into her arms, and he clutched her tightly, both of them shaking. "What does it sound like?" Naomi asked through her tears, forgetting to sign, just speaking. "What do you hear?" Cameron pulled back, touching his ears like they were magic. "Everything sounds fuzzy, weird, but I hear the water running in the sink. I hear, is that my breathing? Do I always make that sound?" He stood up on shaky legs and walked to the window, pressing his hands against the glass. Outside, the morning birds were starting to sing. Cameron's face transformed with wonder. "What is that sound? Those chirping noises? They're so pretty." "Those are birds," Naomi signed and spoke simultaneously. "They sing every morning. You've been looking at them through this window for years, but you've never heard them until now." Cameron turned to her, tears streaming down his face. "I've missed 7 years of bird singing?" The question broke Naomi's heart, but before she could answer, they both heard something else, the sound of the front door opening downstairs. Marcus was home early. Naomi's blood ran cold. Marcus wasn't supposed to be back for 3 more days. She looked at Cameron, at the blood-stained tissues in the bathroom, at the rubber object sitting on the counter like evidence of a crime. "Cameron," Naomi signed urgently, "when your father comes up here, let me do the talking first, okay? He might be upset." "Why?" Cameron asked, his new voice uncertain. "You helped me. You made it so I can hear. Why would Daddy be upset? Why do you think Marcus would be upset? Would you be angry if someone saved your child without your permission?" Marcus's voice echoed through the mansion. "Naomi? Cameron? Where is everyone?" Naomi took a deep breath, squeezed Cameron's hand, and walked out of the bathroom. Cameron followed, and together they went to the top of the stairs. Marcus stood in the foyer, looking exhausted from travel, his briefcase still in his hand. He looked up and saw them. "Sorry I'm back early. The meeting was canceled and I—" He stopped mid-sentence, staring at Cameron. "Why does Cameron look like he's been crying? What happened?" "Daddy," Cameron said, actually said out loud. "Daddy, I can hear!" Marcus froze. His briefcase dropped to the marble floor with a crash that made Cameron flinch at the unexpected loudness. "What? What did you just say?" Marcus whispered. Cameron ran down the stairs, his feet making sounds he'd never heard before. "I can hear, Daddy! I can hear my feet on the stairs! I can hear your voice! I can hear everything!" Marcus looked from Cameron to Naomi, his face cycling through shock, confusion, joy, and then, as his brain caught up with what must have happened, horror. "Naomi! My office! Now!" What Marcus said next would either vindicate Naomi's choice or destroy her life. And Cameron was about to hear his father's anger for the very first time. Marcus stood behind his desk, his hands shaking. Naomi stood across from him, prepared for the worst. Through the door, they could hear Cameron exploring the house, touching things and listening to the sounds they made, discovering a world that had been silent his entire life. "Explain," Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Explain to me what you did to my son." Naomi told him everything. About noticing Cameron's pain, about seeing the discharge, about looking in his ear and finding the foreign object, about spending 45 minutes carefully removing it while Marcus was away. "You performed a medical procedure on my son," Marcus said, his voice rising, "without permission, without training, without any authority whatsoever. Do you understand what you've done? I saved him from an infection that could have— You could have killed him!" Marcus shouted, and somewhere in the house, Cameron probably heard his father yelling for the first time ever. "One wrong move and you could have punctured his eardrum, damaged his ear permanently, caused brain damage. What gave you the right?" "He was in pain," Naomi said, her voice shaking but firm. "He was suffering, and I had watched my brother die from the exact same thing because adults around him were too cautious to act." "So you decided to play doctor? You decided that your guilt over your brother meant you could risk my son's life?" "No!" Naomi's voice broke. "I decided that Cameron deserved someone who would actually look at him instead of running expensive tests. That object was sitting in his ear for who knows how long, and 7 years of specialists never found it. They never even looked." Marcus went pale. What object?" "Wait." Because what Naomi pulled out of her pocket would change everything Marcus thought he knew about his son's deafness. Naomi placed the small rubber object on Marcus's desk. It was clean now, but still clearly visible. A piece of medical tubing, approximately 1 inch long, with distinctive markings on one end. Marcus picked it up with shaking hands. "What is this?" "I think it's part of an ear tube device," Naomi said. "The kind they use for chronic ear infections in babies. It should have dissolved naturally, but it didn't. It stayed lodged in Cameron's ear canal, causing infections and completely blocking his hearing." Marcus stared at the object like it was a bomb. "That's impossible. Cameron's deafness is genetic. We had genetic testing. We consulted the top specialists in the world. They all confirmed—" "Did any of them actually look in his ear canal with a simple flashlight, or did they just run expensive tests and assume the diagnosis was correct?" Marcus's face was white. He sat down heavily in his chair. When Cameron was 6 months old, he had chronic ear infections. Dr. Raymond Cross, one of the best pediatric audiologists in the country, recommended therapeutic ear tubes. He said they dissolve naturally. That was 6.5 years ago. "They didn't dissolve," Naomi said quietly. "At least this one didn't. It stayed lodged in Cameron's right ear, causing inflammation, blocking sound completely, creating infection after infection, and no one looked. No one bothered to do a simple visual examination because they were too busy running sophisticated tests to notice something simple." Marcus put his head in his hands. 7 years. My son spent 7 years in silence because a tube didn't dissolve and no one checked? And because you paid for the most expensive specialists instead of someone who would take the time to really look at your son, Naomi added gently. "I'm not trying to be cruel, Mr. Winters, but sometimes the most important medical care isn't the most expensive. Sometimes it's just paying attention." In exactly 30 minutes, Marcus would discover something that would make him question everything about the medical system he'd trusted. But first, he needed to talk to his son. Marcus found Cameron in the library, holding books up to his ear and dropping them to hear the thud. The simple joy on his son's face, at sounds that most people took for granted, brought Marcus to his knees. "Cameron," Marcus said, and Cameron spun around, his face lighting up. "Daddy! Your voice is deeper than I thought it would be." I've been trying to remember what everyone's voices sounded like from when I was a baby, but I can't. Is this what you always sounded like? Marcus started crying. Yes, buddy. This is what I always sounded like. I'm so sorry. Sorry for what? Cameron asked, confused. I'm sorry that you spent 7 years not hearing. I'm sorry that I paid all that money for specialists who didn't help you. I'm sorry that it took our housekeeper, someone I almost didn't hire, to actually fix what was wrong. Cameron thought about this seriously. Then he said something that would change Marcus's entire perspective. Daddy, I wasn't broken. I was just deaf. Naomi didn't fix me. She helped me hear. Those are different things. Do you see the difference between fixing someone and helping them? Cameron's wisdom in that moment was more than most adults ever learn. Marcus spent the next 2 hours on the phone, first with Dr. Raymond Cross, the audiologist who'd implanted the ear tubes when Cameron was a baby. Mr. Winters, I assure you, those tubes were supposed to dissolve within 6 to 12 months. If one didn't, that's an extremely rare complication. How rare? Marcus demanded. A pause. Approximately 15% of cases show delayed dissolution, but full blockage is quite... 15%? That's not rare, that's common. Why wasn't Cameron examined for this? We did follow-up examinations, multiple times in his first year. And after that? When did you last actually look inside my son's ear canal instead of just running hearing tests? Silence on the other end. Dr. Cross, I want every single medical record from Cameron's first 3 years, every examination note, every test result, everything. And I want them today. Marcus's next call was to his lawyer. I need you to investigate Dr. Raymond Cross and every specialist who examined Cameron over the past 7 years. I want to know if anyone noticed this blockage and didn't report it. I want to know if this is malpractice, negligence, or something worse. His third call was to a medical ethics investigator. What they discovered in those medical records would expose a conspiracy that went far deeper than anyone imagined. The medical records arrived within 4 hours, delivered by a nervous courier who Marcus suspected had been told to rush them over before lawyers got involved. Marcus, his attorney, and Naomi spent the evening going through every page. What they found made Marcus physically ill. Dr. Cross's initial notes from when Cameron was 6 months old mentioned the ear tube implantation, standard procedure, expected dissolution within a year. But here's what they also found. At Cameron's 12-month checkup, a different doctor, Dr. Linda Morrison, had noted possible retained foreign body in right ear canal, recommend follow-up visual examination. That follow-up never happened. At Cameron's 18-month examination, another note from a nurse. Patient showing signs of ear discomfort, right ear appears inflamed, recommend otoscopic examination. That examination never happened either. Instead, at 24 months, Dr. Cross ran a comprehensive hearing test, determined that Cameron had profound bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, and recommended genetic testing and hearing aids. No one ever looked in Cameron's ear again. Every subsequent specialist looked at the diagnosis from Dr. Cross, a renowned audiologist, and accepted it without question. They gave up, Marcus said, his voice hollow. They saw the prestigious diagnosis and just gave up on actually examining my son. Naomi pointed to another document. Look at this. Dr. Cross's research grant. It was funded by a company that makes genetic hearing loss treatments. His entire research focus was on proving that early intervention with their devices improved outcomes. Marcus's lawyer whistled low. If he'd admitted that 15% of his ear tube patients had complications, it would have undermined his research, hurt his reputation, maybe even cost him his funding. So he just moved on to genetic explanations, Marcus said. He let my son suffer for 7 years because admitting the tubes failed would have been inconvenient. Actually, let me pause here because this is important. This isn't a story about one bad doctor. This is about a system that values reputation and research funding over actually healing patients. And it happens more often than anyone wants to admit. Marcus didn't just file a lawsuit. He called a press conference. 2 days later, Marcus stood in front of cameras with Cameron beside him. Cameron, who could now hear every question shouted by reporters, every click of cameras, every sound of the world watching. My name is Marcus Winters. 7 years ago, my son Cameron was diagnosed with permanent genetic deafness. I spent $8 million consulting the world's top specialists. Every single one confirmed the diagnosis. Every single one recommended expensive treatments and devices that didn't work. Marcus paused, his hand on Cameron's shoulder. Then Naomi Bennett, our housekeeper, looked in my son's ear with a $20 flashlight and found what 7 years of specialists had missed, a piece of medical tubing that had been lodged in his ear since he was 6 months old. The press room erupted. Marcus held up his hand. Naomi risked her job, her freedom, and her own well-being to help my son. She removed that object, and within seconds, Cameron could hear, not because of expensive treatments, not because of cutting-edge technology, because someone finally bothered to look. A reporter shouted, "Are you saying the specialist deliberately misdiagnosed your son?" "I'm saying the system failed my son. Dr. Raymond Cross implanted ear tubes that had a known 15% failure rate. When those tubes failed, notes were made in Cameron's file recommending follow-up. Those follow-ups never happened. Instead, Dr. Cross ran expensive tests that confirmed a genetic diagnosis, a diagnosis that matched his research focus and funding priorities." "What about Ms. Bennett? She performed a medical procedure without a license." "Ms. Bennett saved my son's life," Marcus said firmly. "The object she removed was causing severe infection. Left untreated, it could have caused brain damage or death. She acted when medical professionals failed to act, and I'm grateful beyond measure." Cameron stepped up to the microphone. His voice was still rough, still learning, but clear. "Naomi is my hero. She listened when no one else would listen. She looked when no one else would look. And now I can hear. I can hear my daddy's voice. I can hear birds singing. I can hear everything." The room went silent except for the sound of reporters frantically typing. What Marcus announced next would change healthcare for thousands of families, but it would also make powerful enemies. "I'm announcing the creation of the Jeremiah Bennett Foundation," Marcus said, and Naomi gasped. "Named after Naomi's brother, who died from medical negligence because his family couldn't afford the care they deserved. This foundation will provide free comprehensive auditory examinations, real examinations, not just expensive tests, to any family that needs them." Marcus looked directly at the cameras. "We will train medical professionals to actually look at patients, not just at test results. We will challenge the system that values prestigious diagnoses over simple observations. We will make sure that what happened to Cameron and to Jeremiah doesn't happen to other children." "Mr. Winters, who will run this foundation?" Marcus smiled and gestured to Naomi. "Ms. Naomi Bennett will serve as executive director, because she understands something that medical professionals sometimes forget. Healing isn't about expensive equipment or prestigious credentials. It's about caring enough to really see the person you're trying to help." Naomi stood there, tears streaming down her face, as camera flashes exploded around her. The woman who'd been just a maid 3 months ago was now going to lead a foundation that would help thousands of families. 3 months after that press conference, the foundation had opened 23 clinics in underserved communities, but the real transformation was happening in one mansion where silence had been replaced by something much more valuable. The Winters mansion didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It was filled with sound, Cameron's laughter, music playing, conversations between father and son that actually used voices instead of just signs. Cameron had started regular school, made friends, discovered a passion for music that made Marcus cry every time he heard his son singing. But Cameron still signed too. He said being deaf for 7 years taught him things that hearing people never learned, like how to really watch people, how to see emotions that voices might hide. "I'm glad I was deaf," Cameron told Naomi one afternoon as they baked cookies together. Cameron's favorite activity because he loved the sounds of mixing and the timer beeping. "Because it meant you came into my life, and it taught me that being different isn't bad. It's just different." Naomi hugged him. "Your brother Jeremiah would have loved you so much." "I think about him sometimes," Cameron said seriously. "I think about how he didn't get the help he needed because people didn't listen. So I'm going to spend my whole life listening to people. Really listening, the way you listen to me." Marcus, listening from the doorway, felt his heart swell with pride and pain and gratitude all mixed together. "Wait, I need to tell you what happened to Dr. Cross, because justice in this story wasn't just about Cameron getting healed. Dr. Raymond Cross's medical license was suspended pending investigation. 3 other specialists who'd examined Cameron faced ethics reviews for failing to follow up on documented concerns in his medical records. But the real reckoning came when 18 other families came forward. 18 other children who'd been diagnosed with genetic hearing loss by Dr. Cross. 18 families who'd spent years and fortunes on treatments that didn't work. The medical investigator found that 12 of those children had retained ear tubes, just like Cameron. 12 children who'd spent years in unnecessary silence because Dr. Cross was more interested in his research than in actually helping his patients. The lawsuits were massive. The medical community was shaken, and reforms were put in place requiring visual examinations before genetic diagnoses could be made. But for Marcus, the real justice was much simpler. It was watching Cameron hear his first thunderstorm, his first ocean waves, his first "I love you, Daddy" spoken out loud instead of just signed. Do you think Dr. Cross was evil, or just so focused on being important that he forgot to be helpful? Sometimes the line between the two is thinner than we want to believe. 1 year after Naomi removed that object from Cameron's ear, she took him to visit Jeremiah's grave for the first time. "This is your brother?" Cameron asked, reading the headstone. "The one I'm named after? Kind of?" The foundation was officially called the Jeremiah Bennett Foundation, but Cameron had started calling it JB and Cam's Promise, a promise that no child would be ignored again. "Yes," Naomi said. "He made me promise that if I ever met another deaf kid, I would help them. He made me promise not to let anyone feel as alone as he felt." "Did I feel alone?" Cameron asked. "Yes, honey, very alone." Cameron was quiet for a moment, then placed a drawing he'd made on Jeremiah's grave. It showed 2 boys, one who couldn't hear and one who could, holding hands. "I'm not alone anymore," Cameron said. "And because of Jeremiah, other kids won't be alone either. That's a good promise to keep." Naomi cried, but they were good tears this time. Healing tears. The tears that come when a promise made in grief finally becomes a promise fulfilled with joy. The story ends not with a dramatic moment, but with a quiet one. Cameron, now 8 years old, sits at a piano, an instrument he'd never understood when he was deaf, but now can't get enough of. He's playing a simple song he composed himself titled Naomi's Bravery. It's not technically perfect. Some of the notes are a bit off-key, but it's beautiful because it's real, because it's played by a child who wasn't supposed to ever hear music. Marcus stands in the doorway, watching. Naomi sits on the couch, smiling, and from the speakers of Marcus's phone, a conference call plays. The foundation is on track to help 500 children this year. Cameron finishes his song, turns around, and signs and speaks simultaneously. "Did you like it?" "It was perfect," Naomi signs and speaks back. "Know what my favorite sound is?" Cameron asks. "What?" "Your voice. Because it was the first sound I heard when I could finally hear again. And it said, 'I hear you,' and that's the most important thing anyone has ever said to me." Dr. Raymond Cross lost his medical license and faces criminal negligence charges. Sometimes the greatest medical breakthroughs don't come from laboratories or research grants. Sometimes they come from someone who cares enough to really look, really listen, and really see the person in front of them. This story is dedicated to every Jeremiah who wasn't heard in time and every Cameron who was saved because someone refused to give up. If you're still here, if you made it all the way through Cameron and Naomi's story, then you're part of something important. You're part of a community that believes in second chances, in challenging authority when it's wrong, in listening to the people society dismisses. Hit that subscribe button, not just for me, but because you want to be part of a community that values these stories. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories that challenge us to be braver, kinder, more willing to risk something to help someone. Be that person. Share this story. Let it inspire you to look closer, listen harder. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring.